Welcome to Dreamy History. Here's what makes no sense about Prussia. It shouldn't have existed, let alone become one of Europe's most feared and admired military powers. We're talking about a state that, for centuries, was essentially Europe's forgotten backyard. A vast sandy, boggy expanse in the northeast, utterly devoid of natural defences or significant resources. Imagine a territory so unappealing, so strategically vulnerable, that it was often dismissed as the quote zero. It had no mountains to protect it, no major rivers for easy trade, no rich mineral deposits to fuel industry. Its capital, Berlin, wasn't a venerable ancient city like Rome or Paris, but a relatively new settlement in the middle of nowhere. It was a region perpetually caught between powerful neighbours, constantly threatened by Swedes, Poles, Russians, and Habsburgs. Every logical, geographical, economic, and political indicator pointed to its inevitable absorption or fragmentation, and yet this unlikely, impoverished land, ruled by a relatively obscure dynasty, not only survived but thrived. It defied every expectation, transforming itself into a disciplined, innovative, and utterly relentless force that would eventually unite Germany and fundamentally reshape the map of Europe. The story of Prussia is a masterclass in turning profound disadvantages into an iron will, a narrative of human ingenuity, strategic ruthlessness, and an almost fanatical dedication to the state, forged in the crucible of desperation. It's a story that challenges everything you think you know about how nations rise and fall, and it's endlessly fascinating for that very reason. If you're enjoying this journey through history, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And I'm always curious. Drop a comment letting me know what city and time zone you're watching from. There's something special about knowing this story is reaching people all over the world. Let's start with the obvious question nobody asks. How did a dynasty from a relatively minor Swabian castle end up ruling a sandy, forgotten corner of the Holy Roman Empire, let alone forge a world power from it? This isn't a story of grand conquests or vast inheritances at the outset. This is a story of a medieval land grab that seemed, at the time, like a deeply unpromising investment. Think about this for a second. It's the early 15th century, and the Holy Roman Empire is a patchwork quilt of hundreds of states, all nominally under the emperor but largely independent. Among these, the Margraviate of Brandenburg was frankly a mess. It was one of the seven *1, meaning its ruler, the elector, had the privilege of voting for the next Holy Roman Emperor. A prestigious title, certainly, but in Brandenburg's case, it was attached to a land that was economically struggling and politically fractured. After decades of internal strife, banditry, and a succession of weak or absent rulers, Brandenburg was ripe for a strong hand. Enter Frederick VI, Burgrave of Nuremberg, a man of the Hohenzollern family. The Hohenzollerns were not a grand ancient royal house in the way the Habsburgs or Valois were. Their origins were more modest, rooted in Swabia, a region in the southwestern part of modern Germany. They were known for their administrative skill and fiscal acumen, managing their territories efficiently, but they lacked the vast lands and prestige of the truly great houses. In 1411, Emperor Sigismund, desperate for funds and a reliable ally to bring order to Brandenburg, pawned the Margraviate to Frederick for a considerable sum, 400,000 Hungarian florins. 4 years later, in 1415, at the Council of Constance, Sigismund officially granted Frederick the Margraviate and the Electorate of Brandenburg, making him Frederick I, Elector of Brandenburg. This wasn't some glorious ascent. It was a desperate measure by an emperor and a shrewd, if seemingly uninspired acquisition by a burgrave. What Frederick I inherited was less a jewel and more a burden. The Mark Brandenburg, as it was known, was a vast, low-lying plain, largely covered in pine forests, swamps, and famously sand. Its soil was poor, yielding meagre harvests compared to the fertile Rhineland or the Danube basin. The climate was harsh, with long cold winters. There were no significant mineral deposits, no major trade routes running through it, and no natural frontiers to protect it from ambitious neighbours. The population was sparse, and the towns, including Berlin, were small and relatively insignificant. The local nobility, the Junkers, were fiercely independent and had grown accustomed to centuries of minimal oversight, effectively running their own small domains like petty kings. Bandits roamed the roads, and the economy was in tatters. It was, in essence, a frontier land, backward and impoverished, a far cry from the rich, cultured courts of Western Europe. Frederick I and his successors faced an unenviable task: to consolidate power in this unruly, barren land. Their initial strategy was one of slow, painstaking internal development and consolidation. They had to assert their authority over the Junkers, who saw the new elector as little more than a distant overlord. This wasn't achieved through grand battles, but through patient diplomacy, strategic alliances, and, when necessary, direct military action against rebellious nobles and robber barons. One of Frederick's immediate challenges was the Quote II, a powerful noble family that had essentially turned large parts of Brandenburg into their private raiding ground. Frederick, with imperial backing and a willingness to use force, eventually subdued them, signalling that a new, more assertive authority had arrived. The Hohenzollerns also understood the importance of economic development, however slow. They encouraged settlement, draining marshes to create new agricultural land, though the yields remained modest. They fostered the growth of towns like Berlin and Tulln, two distinct towns on either side of the Spree River, which would later merge, recognizing them as potential sources of revenue and loyal administration. The electorate's economy was primarily agrarian, based on rye, oats and potatoes, with some timber and fish from its numerous lakes. It was not an economy that screamed future superpower. The arrival of the Reformation in the early 16th century proved to be a pivotal moment for the Hohenzollerns. Elector Joachim II Hector officially adopted Lutheranism in 1539, though the process of conversion had been gradual. This move was not purely theological, it was deeply pragmatic. By embracing Protestantism, Joachim II gained immense power. He secularized vast church lands, confiscating them from the Catholic Church and bringing them under the direct control of the elector. This provided a much-needed boost to the state's finances and administrative reach, allowing the Hohenzollerns to build a more centralized government and even a modest standing army, which was almost unheard of for such a poor state. It also severed religious ties to the Catholic Habsburg emperors, subtly increasing Brandenburg's autonomy within the empire. This was a classic Hohenzollern move, pragmatic, opportunistic, and ultimately strengthening the state. But Brandenburg alone, even with its slow consolidation and the gains from the Reformation, was never going to be a major player. It needed something more, and that something more came from a distant, even more obscure land to the northeast, the Duchy of Prussia. This was an entirely separate territory, historically distinct from Brandenburg, lying outside the borders of the Holy Roman Empire along the Baltic Sea. Its history was rooted in the Teutonic Knights, a crusading military order that had conquered and Christianized the pagan Old Prussians in the 13th century. By the early 16th century, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Albert of Hohenzollern, a cousin of the Brandenburg line, had secularized the order's lands, converting them into a hereditary duchy under Polish suzerainty. This became the Duchy of Prussia, with its capital at Königsberg. The connection to Brandenburg was forged through a series of carefully managed marriages and dynastic maneuvers. In 1618, Albert Frederick, the second Duke of Prussia, died without a male heir. His eldest daughter Anna had married John Sigismund, the Elector of Brandenburg. Through this marriage and the subsequent inheritance, the Duchy of Prussia passed to the Brandenburg Hohenzollerns. Suddenly the Elector of Brandenburg was also the Duke of Prussia. This was a profoundly significant yet geographically awkward development. The Hohenzollern lands now consisted of two main blocks: the Margraviate of Brandenburg, centred on Berlin, and the Duchy of Prussia, centred on Königsberg, separated by a vast stretch of Polish territory. Furthermore, through other inheritances, the Hohenzollerns had also acquired territories in western Germany, notably Cleves, Mark, and Ravensburg, adding even more disconnected pieces to their growing disparate puzzle. This created a state that was fractured, unwieldy, and incredibly vulnerable. And we're only getting started. The challenge of ruling these fragmented lands, of consolidating them into a coherent whole, and of protecting them from powerful neighbours, would define the next century of Hohenzollern rule. But that's a story for the next chapter. Welcome back to Dreamy History, where we unravel the improbable rise of Prussia. In our last chapter, we left off at a truly precarious moment for the nascent Hohenzollern state. It was 1618, and the Elector of Brandenburg had just inherited the distant Duchy of Prussia, along with various territories in western Germany like Cleves, Mark, and Ravensburg. On paper, it sounded like a grand expansion, a royal lottery win. In reality, it was less a jewel and more a burden, a sprawling, disconnected collection of lands that made Brandenburg Prussia perhaps the most vulnerable state in all of Europe. Imagine, if you will, a jigsaw puzzle dumped onto the map, its pieces scattered across hundreds of miles, separated by powerful, often hostile neighbours, and speaking different dialects, adhering to different laws, even different Christian denominations. Brandenburg was Lutheran, the new ruler was Calvinist, and parts of the Western territories were staunchly Catholic. There were no natural borders to speak of, no mountain ranges or broad rivers to offer defence, just a low-lying plain, largely covered in pine forests, swamps, and famously sand, now stretched thin across a vast exposed front. This wasn't a kingdom, it was a target. The year 1618, the year of this inheritance, also marked the beginning of perhaps the most destructive conflict in European history before the World Wars, the 30 Years' War. This wasn't merely a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, though it certainly had those roots. It was a brutal, existential struggle for power, for territory, for the very soul of the Holy Roman Empire and by extension for the future of Europe. And Brandenburg, sitting right in the middle, was about to become the unwilling stage for its bloodiest acts. What could the Hohenzollerns do? They were a relatively minor power, their treasury still modest despite the secularization of church lands, their army small and largely mercenary. Their new lands were economically underdeveloped, their population sparse. Their strategy initially was one of desperate neutrality. They tried to appease both sides, to avoid drawing the wrath of the Swedish king, the Catholic Habsburg emperor, or the countless other armies crisscrossing the continent. It was a strategy born not of cowardice, but of sheer, unadulterated weakness. They had no other choice. But neutrality, as we often see in history, is a luxury afforded only to the strong or the truly insignificant. Brandenburg was neither. It was a strategic corridor, a breadbasket, albeit a sandy one, and a convenient place for armies to march through, forage, and plunder. And so the war came. The devastation that swept over Brandenburg was almost unfathomable. Wave after wave of armies, Imperial, Swedish, Saxon, Danish, French, mercenary bands of every stripe, descended upon the land. They weren't just passing through. They were living off the land, often taking everything down to the last chicken and the last nail. Towns were sacked, villages burned, fields laid waste. Famine became widespread, followed by plague, which thrived in the wake of malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. Imagine the horror, the constant fear of marauding soldiers, the sight of your home reduced to ashes, the gnawing hunger, the silent dread of disease. The population of Brandenburg plummeted, in some areas by as much as 50% or even 75%. It was a demographic catastrophe, a wasteland where once there had been struggling but living communities. Berlin, the capital, shrunk from around 10,000 inhabitants to a mere 3,000. It was a ghost of its former self, a testament to the brutal realities of a Europe consumed by war. This period was the ultimate test for the Hohenzollerns. They watched their lands being ravaged, their people decimated, their authority challenged by foreign commanders who treated Brandenburg as their personal fiefdom. The Junkers, the local nobility, were often powerless to resist, their estates ruined, their tenants scattered. The Elector, George William, was famously indecisive, caught between conflicting loyalties and utterly overwhelmed by the scale of the conflict. He tried to maintain a small standing force, but it was often unpaid, undisciplined, and utterly inadequate against the veteran armies of Gustavus Adolphus or Wallenstein. But within this abyss of destruction, a profound lesson was being etched into the very soul of the Hohenzollern dynasty and, by extension, into the identity of Prussia. This was the brutal realization that survival depended entirely on self-reliance, on a strong, disciplined, and utterly loyal military, and on a centralized state apparatus capable of supporting it. No amount of diplomacy, no plea for neutrality, no reliance on allies could save a state that could not defend itself. The weakness of the present was a death sentence. Strength was the only path to autonomy, indeed to existence. It was from these ashes, from this crucible of unparalleled suffering, that a new leader emerged, Frederick William, later to be known as the Swiss. 6. Born in 1620, he grew up amidst the chaos and devastation of the 30 Years' War. His formative years were spent not in the luxury of a royal court, but in the stark reality of a state teetering on the brink of collapse. He witnessed firsthand the humiliation of his father, the impotence of a ruler without power, and the unimaginable suffering of his people. This experience, rather than breaking him, forged in him an iron will, a steely resolve to ensure that Brandenburg Prussia would never again be so vulnerable. He understood, with a clarity few rulers ever achieved, that the very existence of his state depended on radical transformation. He was a pragmatist to his core, utterly devoid of romantic notions, driven by a singular, almost fanatical dedication to the survival and strengthening of the state. When Frederick William ascended to the electorate in 1640, the situation was dire. The Peace of Westphalia, which would finally end the 30 Years' War, was still 8 years away. His territories were still occupied by foreign troops, his treasury was empty, his administration was in disarray, and his army was a pathetic shadow of a fighting force. He inherited a ruin, a collection of disparate lands ravaged by war, disease, and depopulation. But Frederick William was not one to despair. He immediately set about the monumental task of rebuilding. His vision was clear, if incredibly ambitious, to create a state that, despite its geographical disadvantages and lack of natural resources, could defend itself and project its will. This would require a complete overhaul of the state, focusing on 3 interconnected pillars: a strong, standing army, a centralized, efficient bureaucracy, and a robust, if modest, economy to fund it all. His first priority, and arguably the most enduring legacy of the Hohenzollerns, was the military. He understood that a professional standing army, loyal only to the elector, was the bedrock of sovereignty. Gone were the days of relying on unreliable mercenaries or the feudal levies of the Junkers. Frederick William began the slow, painstaking process of building a modern army from scratch. He imposed a regular tax to fund it, bypassing the traditional estates, Landstand, where possible, and began recruiting and training soldiers with unprecedented rigour. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about discipline, about order, about instilling a sense of belonging to a greater entity, the state. This focus on the military, however, was not an end in itself. It was a means to an end, to secure the state, to protect its people, and to provide the stability necessary for economic recovery. Frederick William actively encouraged immigration, particularly of skilled workers and farmers, to repopulate his devastated lands. He offered incentives, religious tolerance, and protection to those who would come and rebuild. This pragmatic approach to religious diversity, a stark contrast to the religious absolutism prevalent elsewhere in Europe, was a calculated move to attract talent and foster economic growth regardless of creed. To administer this growing army and recovering economy, Frederick William also began to centralize the bureaucracy. He created a system of councils and commissioners directly answerable to him to manage finances, justice, and military affairs across all his disparate territories. This was a direct challenge to the traditional power of the Junkers and the local estates, who had long enjoyed considerable autonomy. He understood that a fragmented state could not survive in the cutthroat world of 17th century Europe. Authority had to be consolidated, loyalty had to be absolute. The Junkers, fiercely independent and accustomed to minimal oversight, initially resisted these centralizing efforts. They saw their ancient rights and privileges being eroded by a distant ruler. But Frederick William, patient yet unyielding, used a combination of persuasion, pressure, and strategic concessions to bring them into line. He offered them positions in his army and administration, integrating them into the very system they initially opposed. In exchange for their loyalty and their agreement to regular taxation, he often confirmed their control over their serfs and local justice. This was a shrewd bargain, one that would cement the Junker's place as the backbone of the Prussian military bureaucratic state for centuries to come. By the time the Peace of Westphalia finally brought an end to the 30 Years' War in 1648, Brandenburg Prussia was still a shadow of what it would become. But under Frederick William, the seeds of its future greatness had been sown. The lesson of the war had been learned. Weakness invites disaster, and only an unyielding commitment to state power, backed by military might and administrative efficiency, could guarantee survival. The sandbox of the Holy Roman Empire was beginning to understand that its very lack of natural advantages would force it to become something uniquely resilient, something forged in the crucible of desperation, something driven by an iron will. The stage was set for an extraordinary transformation. Welcome back to Dreamy History, where we're pulling back the curtain on one of Europe's most improbable success stories, the rise of Prussia. If you've been with us, you know we left off with Frederick William, the young elector, inheriting a land ravaged by the 30 Years' War. Brandenburg Prussia was a fractured, impoverished, and utterly vulnerable collection of territories, a tattered cloak barely covering the bones of a once aspiring state. But what we also know is that this crucible of desperation, this landscape of ruin, forged in him an iron will and a pragmatic vision that would redefine his dynasty and his destiny. Now, let's dive into the monumental task that lay before him, a challenge so immense it would have broken a lesser man. How do you take a state that isn't really a state, a geographical jigsaw puzzle with pieces scattered across northern Europe, separated by hostile powers and foreign lands, and turn it into a cohesive, respected and feared entity? This, dear listeners, is the story of Frederick William, the man who would earn the moniker the Great Elector, and how he began to forge an iron state from the very sand and swamps of his ancestral lands. Imagine, if you will, the electorate of Brandenburg in 1648, after the Peace of Westphalia. It was less a unified nation, and more a collection of properties. Berlin and its surrounding lands, the distant Duchy of Prussia to the east, still a Polish fief, and a smattering of territories in western Germany, like Cleves and Mark, separated by hundreds of miles of foreign soil. There was no shared identity, no common economy, and certainly no unified defence. It was a strategic nightmare, a target-rich environment for any ambitious neighbour. Frederick William understood this deeply. He had seen firsthand the cost of weakness, the futility of neutrality without strength to back it up. His answer was audacious, unwavering, and utterly relentless. The creation of a powerful professional standing army, funded by a centralized bureaucracy and loyal only to him. This wasn't just about defense, it was about state building. In a fragmented land, the army would become the sinews and bones that held the disparate parts together. We've talked about the army before, but its role under Frederick William cannot be overstated. It was not merely a military force, it was the primary instrument of state power, the engine of centralization, and the ultimate arbiter of the elector's will. To fund it, Frederick William had to break the traditional power of the Junkers and the provincial estates, who held the purse strings and guarded their local privileges fiercely. He did this with a shrewd mix of coercion and co-option. He established a system of regular taxation, bypassing the old feudal assemblies whenever possible, and enforced collection with the very soldiers the taxes funded. This was a direct challenge to centuries of local autonomy, and it met with resistance, sometimes open rebellion. But Frederick William was unyielding. He understood that the survival of his state depended on a reliable revenue stream, and he was prepared to use force to secure it. At the same time, he offered the Junkers a Faustian bargain. In exchange for their loyalty, their tax contributions, and their service, and the service of their sons, in his officer corps, he would solidify their control over their serfs and their local jurisdictions. They retained their social dominance and economic power, but now within a framework dictated by the elector. This was a brilliant, if ruthless, compromise. It integrated the most powerful segment of society into the state apparatus, transforming potential rivals into pillars of the system. The army thus became a social elevator, a source of prestige, and a crucial bond between the local aristocracy and the central state. Parallel to the military build-up, Frederick William systematically dismantled the old decentralized administrative structures. He created a highly efficient centralized bureaucracy staffed by loyal, educated commoners and nobles, directly answerable to him. This new administration, often run by military officers, was designed to be effective, incorruptible, and utterly dedicated to the elector's service. It was the administrative arm that collected taxes, managed state lands, and implemented his policies across all his territories. Imagine the sheer administrative challenge of governing lands separated by hundreds of miles, speaking different dialects, and accustomed to different laws. Frederick William's solution was to impose a uniform system, a testament to his incredible will and foresight. He created a general war commissariat and a general finance directory, which eventually merged to form the General Directory, the supreme administrative body of the state. This was a masterclass in modern governance, a pioneering effort in a Europe still largely mired in feudal particularism. While Frederick William was busy consolidating his internal power, the wider European stage was anything but calm. The mid-17th century saw the eruption of the Second Northern War, 1655 to 1660, often called the Swedish Deluge, a brutal conflict that reshaped the Baltic region. Sweden, under the ambitious Charles X Gustav, sought to expand its dominance, clashing with Poland, Lithuania, and eventually Denmark, Russia, and the Holy Roman Empire. For Brandenburg Prussia, this was both an existential threat and an unprecedented opportunity. Trapped between these warring giants, Frederick William had to navigate a diplomatic minefield with the skill of a seasoned tightrope walker. His strategy was pure pragmatism, devoid of sentimentality, focused solely on the survival and advancement of his state. He shifted alliances with astonishing speed, always seeking the greatest advantage for Brandenburg Prussia. Initially, he allied with Sweden, recognizing their military superiority and hoping to gain from their conquests. His newly trained Brandenburg Prussian troops fought alongside the Swedes, most famously at the Battle of Warsaw in 1656. This three-day engagement was a brutal affair. but it proved the mettle of Frederick William's army. They fought with the discipline and effectiveness that earned them international respect, demonstrating that Brandenburg Prussia was no longer a negligible force. But Frederick William was no one's junior partner for long. As the tide of war turned and Swedish fortunes waned, he shrewdly switched his allegiance to Poland. This move, seen by some as opportunistic, was in fact a stroke of genius. It allowed him to leverage his military strength and newfound diplomatic weight to achieve what had been an elusive dream for generations of Hohenzollerns: full sovereignty over the Duchy of Prussia. This, my friends, is one of the most pivotal moments in Prussian history. Through the Treaty of Wehlau in 1657, confirmed by the Sestor Peace of Oliva in 1660, Poland formally renounced its suzerainty over Ducal Prussia. For centuries, the Hohenzollerns had ruled Prussia as vassals of the Polish crown, a constant source of diplomatic awkwardness and political vulnerability. Now, that ancient bond was severed. Think about the implications. For the first time, a core Hohenzollern territory was entirely independent, free from any feudal overlord. This wasn't just a legalistic detail. It was a profound shift in status. It meant that the Elector of Brandenburg, who was also the Duke of Prussia, could now act as a sovereign prince on the international stage, at least in his Prussian capacity. It laid the groundwork for the future kingdom in Prussia, providing a sovereign title that would eventually be adopted for the entire state. It was a massive step towards unifying the disparate Hohenzollern lands under a single, independent authority, a vital component in the identity of the future Prussian state. With external recognition secured for his eastern lands, Frederick William turned his attention back to internal development. The 30 Years' War had left Brandenburg depopulated, its towns in ruins and its economy shattered. Frederick William understood that a strong state needed not only soldiers and administrators, but also people, skills, and wealth. His economic policies were a blend of mercantilism and pragmatic innovation. He encouraged trade, improved infrastructure, and promoted new industries. But perhaps his most famous and impactful policy was his open-door approach to immigration. He actively sought out skilled workers, merchants and farmers from across Europe, offering them incentives to settle in his war-torn lands. The most celebrated example of this policy came with the Edict of Potsdam in 1685. In that year, King Louis XIV of France revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted religious freedom to French Protestants, the Huguenots. This led to a mass exodus of Huguenots, some of France's most skilled artisans, merchants, and intellectuals. Frederick William, a staunch Calvinist himself, immediately seized the opportunity. He offered the fleeing Huguenots refuge in Brandenburg, Prussia, promising them religious freedom, financial assistance, and land. This was a masterstroke. Tens of thousands of Huguenots, bringing with them invaluable skills in textiles, glassmaking, jewellery, and administration, poured into Brandenburg, Prussia. They revitalized the economy, introduced new technologies, and helped repopulate devastated areas, particularly Berlin, which saw its population swell and its cultural life enriched. This pragmatic religious tolerance, extended to all Protestants, became a hallmark of the Hohenzollern state, drawing talent and contributing to its economic and intellectual vibrancy. It was another clear example of Frederick William's strategic vision, turning a profound humanitarian crisis elsewhere into a direct benefit for his struggling state. The legacy of the Great Elector. By the time Frederick William died in 1688, he had utterly transformed Brandenburg Prussia. He had taken a collection of impoverished, fragmented, and vulnerable territories, and through sheer force of will, strategic cunning, and relentless administrative reform, forged them into a nascent power. He had built a formidable army, established a centralized and efficient bureaucracy, secured full sovereignty over ducal Prussia, and laid the foundations for economic recovery. He wasn't just an elector, he was an institution builder. He instilled in his state a profound sense of discipline, a dedication to service, and an unwavering commitment to its own survival and growth. The quote 11 we speak of, the pragmatic ruthlessness, the fanatical dedication to the state. These were not just abstract concepts, they were personified in Frederick William. He was, without doubt, the quote 12, a title well earned for his monumental achievements. His reign set the stage for the next crucial step in Prussia's journey. He left his son, Frederick III, not a mere margraviate, but a state with a standing army, a functioning administration, and crucially a sovereign title in the East. The dream of a kingdom, of turning that Duchy of Prussia into a kingdom in Prussia, was now within reach, and it would be Frederick III, a man of different temperament but inheriting his father's ambition, who would take that final symbolic leap. But that, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. Join us again as we explore how the Hohenzollerns finally achieved the ultimate symbol of European power, a crown. Welcome back, fellow history enthusiasts, to our journey through the improbable rise of Prussia. If you've been with us, you'll recall that we left off with the passing of Frederick William, the Great Elector, in 1688. He had transformed a collection of vulnerable, disparate territories into a nascent power, armed with a formidable standing army, an efficient centralized administration, and crucially a sovereign Duchy of Prussia, now free from Polish suzerainty. It was a foundation of iron, meticulously laid brick by brick. But a foundation, however sturdy, is still just a foundation. It lacked the glittering capstone, the ultimate symbol of European power and legitimacy, a crown. And this, dear friends, was the burning ambition that consumed Frederick William's son and successor, Frederick III. Frederick III was, in many ways, a different breed from his stern, pragmatic father. Where the Great Elector was a man of action, often found in the field or poring over state documents, Frederick III had a taste for the finer things in life. He was a patron of the arts, a builder of magnificent palaces. Charlottenburg, for instance, bears his mark, and a man who understood the immense power of spectacle and prestige. He yearned for his court to rival the grandeur of Versailles, to elevate Brandenburg Prussia beyond its reputation as Europe's diligent but somewhat drab military camp. But don't mistake his love of pomp for mere vanity. Frederick III was no lightweight. Beneath the powdered wigs and embroidered silks beat a heart as fiercely ambitious as any Hohenzollern, though his ambition manifested differently. He understood that in the intricate dance of European diplomacy, status was currency. A princely elector, even a powerful one, still bowed to kings. To truly solidify the Hohenzollerns' position, to silence the whispers of their humble origins, and to ensure the long-term future of their hard-won sovereignty, a crown was not just a desire, it was a strategic imperative. It was the ultimate validation, the public declaration that Prussia had arrived. Imagine the situation. Here was a state, forged in the crucible of desperation, built on sand and pine forests, yet possessing an army that commanded respect and a bureaucracy that could rival any. And yet, its ruler was merely an elector, a prince among many in the Holy Roman Empire. This disparity between actual power and perceived status was a thorn in Frederick III's side, and he was determined to extract it. The path to a royal crown, however, was not straightforward. This wasn't simply a matter of declaring oneself king. Europe, particularly the Holy Roman Empire, was a labyrinth of ancient traditions, carefully guarded hierarchies and entrenched interests. Within the empire, only the King of Bohemia held a royal title, and that was tied to his electoral dignity. For an elector to unilaterally declare himself king would be an affront to the emperor, a challenge to the established order, and a guaranteed recipe for diplomatic disaster. Remember, the Hohenzollerns were still technically electors of Brandenburg within the Holy Roman Empire. Their ambition for a crown had to be carefully managed, lest it provoke the wrath of Emperor Leopold I, a staunch Habsburg who guarded imperial prerogatives with ferocity. Leopold was unlikely to simply hand out royal titles like party favours. He was a man who understood power, and he would demand a significant price for such a monumental concession. This is where the great elector's foresight, securing full sovereignty over the Duchy of Prussia from Poland, became absolutely critical. The Duchy of Prussia, unlike Brandenburg, lay outside the formal boundaries of the Holy Roman Empire. This geographical and legal distinction was the loophole, the key that would unlock Frederick III's royal dreams. He couldn't be King of Brandenburg without challenging the Emperor directly, but he could potentially be king in Prussia, a territory over which the Emperor had no direct suzerainty. It was a subtle, yet profound, legal distinction that would prove to be a masterstroke of Hohenzollern pragmatism. History, as we often see, has a way of presenting opportunities disguised as crises. For Frederick III, that crisis came in the form of the looming War of the Spanish Succession. This was a continental powder keg, threatening to reshape the balance of power across Europe. The childless death of Charles II of Spain in 1700 ignited a fierce struggle between the French House of Bourbon and the Austrian House of Habsburg for control of the vast Spanish Empire. Emperor Leopold I, as head of the Habsburg dynasty, desperately needed allies and reliable troops to prosecute his claim against the formidable might of Louis XIV's France. And who, among the German princes, possessed one of the most disciplined and effective armies in Europe? You guessed it, Brandenburg, Prussia. Frederick III, with his shrewd political instincts, recognized this as his golden moment. He understood that his army, forged by his father into a lean, mean fighting machine, was his greatest bargaining chip. The emperor needed him, and Frederick was prepared to make him pay dearly for that support. Negotiations were intense and protracted. Leopold I, for his part, was reluctant to set a precedent by elevating another German prince to royal status. He worried about diluting his own authority and upsetting the delicate balance of power within the empire. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, or in this case, the mother of imperial concessions. The French threat was simply too great to ignore, Frederick III drove a hard bargain. He pledged 8,000 Prussian troops to the Habsburg cause in the War of the Spanish Succession, a significant military commitment. He also promised financial subsidies and, crucially, vowed to vote for the Habsburg candidate in future imperial elections. In return, Leopold I, with a heavy heart, finally consented to Frederick's long-cherished desire. On November 16, 1700, the Imperial Crown Treaty was signed. Frederick III was granted permission to assume the title of King in Prussia. Not King of Prussia, mind you, but King in Prussia. This distinction was vital. It acknowledged his royal status within his sovereign duchy, but subtly avoided directly challenging the emperor's authority over Brandenburg and the other imperial territories. It was a diplomatic compromise, a nod to tradition while forging a new reality. With the emperor's blessing secured, Frederick III wasted no time. He immediately began preparations for a coronation of unprecedented grandeur. He chose Königsberg, the capital of the Duchy of Prussia, as the site for this momentous event. This was a deliberate choice, emphasizing the sovereignty of the new kingdom and its distinct identity from the imperial heartland of Brandenburg. On January 18th, 1701, amidst a blizzard of snow and a flurry of trumpets, Frederick III crowned himself King Frederick I in Prussia. In a symbolic act of self-assertion, he placed the crown upon his own head and then upon the head of his wife, Sophie Charlotte. This was not a coronation by a pope or an emperor, but a declaration of inherent sovereign authority, echoing the ancient tradition of Germanic kings. The ceremony was lavish, costing millions of thalers, a staggering sum that nearly bankrupted the state, much to the chagrin of his more frugal successors. But for Frederick, it was money well spent. It was an investment in prestige, in legitimacy, in the very future of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Imagine the scene, the grand procession, the cheering crowds, or at least the bewildered residents of Königsberg, the glittering regalia, the sheer weight of expectation. It was a moment of profound transformation, not just for Frederick, but for the very entity we now call Prussia. So what did this new royal title truly mean? Beyond the immediate gratification of Frederick III's personal ambition and the dazzling spectacle of the coronation, the establishment of the kingdom in Prussia was a pivotal moment in European history. Firstly, it elevated the Hohenzollerns onto the same diplomatic playing field as the other great royal houses of Europe. No longer merely electors, they were now kings, with all the accompanying rights, respect and influence that title commanded. This dramatically improved their standing in international negotiations and alliances. Secondly, it provided a powerful unifying identity for the disparate Hohenzollern territories. The name, quote, 15, once a remote, largely forgotten duchy, now became synonymous with the entire Hohenzollern state. It provided a rallying point, a common banner under which Brandenburgers, Pomeranians, Klevsmarkians, and East Prussians could begin to forge a collective identity. This was crucial for continuing the great elector's work of centralization and integration. The name Prussia would eventually encompass all the Hohenzollern lands, even those within the empire becoming a powerful brand. Thirdly, and perhaps most subtly, it solidified the concept of the state as a single sovereign entity. The crown symbolized the indivisibility of the Hohenzollern rule and the growing independence of their lands from external powers, particularly the Holy Roman Empire. It was a tangible manifestation of the iron will that had driven their rise. The cost was immense, both financially and in terms of military commitment. But for Frederick I, it was a necessary expenditure to secure the future. He may have been more focused on outward grandeur than his father, but his achievement was no less significant. He had taken the solid, if unglamorous, foundations laid by the great Elector and crowned them with the ultimate symbol of power. By the time Frederick I passed away in 1713, he had left his heir, Frederick William I, not just a state, but a kingdom. It was a kingdom still struggling with its finances, still finding its footing among the giants of Europe, but a kingdom nonetheless. And it was this newly minted kingdom in Prussia, with its still fragmented territories and its demanding new status, that would now face the challenge of proving its worth, of living up to the weight of its new crown. The stage was set for the next act in Prussia's remarkable story, an act that would be defined by a very different kind of king. Join us next time as we delve into the reign of Frederick William I, the Assistent, quote 18, who would strip away the gilded excess and forge the Prussian state into an even sharper instrument of power and discipline. You won't want to miss it. Welcome back, history enthusiasts. We left our story with Frederick I, the first king in Prussia, passing the crown to his son in 1713. He had achieved his personal ambition, elevating the Hohenzollern dynasty to royal status and giving their disparate lands a unifying name. But let's be honest, his kingdom was less a jewel and more a burden, financially strained and still very much a fledgling power in a Europe teeming with established giants. The question now, the one hanging heavy in the air, was what would become of this newly minted monarchy? How would it survive, let alone thrive, when its treasury was depleted and its identity still largely fragmented? Well, dear friends, if you thought Frederick I's reign was defined by a quest for prestige, prepare yourselves for a jarring shift. Because the man who inherited this kingdom, Frederick William I, was cut from an entirely different cloth. He was, in many ways, the antithesis of his father, and his ascension marked a profound, almost brutal, reorientation of Prussia's trajectory. If Frederick I loved the pomp and circumstance of royalty, Frederick William I despised it. If his father built palaces, this new king built an army, and if you're looking for the architect of the truly Prussian state, the one defined by iron discipline, relentless efficiency, and a formidable military machine, you found him. Frederick William I, often known to history as the Soldier King, was a force of nature, a whirlwind of pragmatic reform and unyielding will. He ascended the throne at 25, and from day one he made his intentions clear. No more lavish spending, no more Frenchified court, no more frivolous pursuits. He saw the kingdom, and particularly its finances, with the cold, hard clarity of an accountant staring at a deficit. His father's pursuit of a crown had come at a steep price, leaving the state teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Frederick William I's immediate mission was to fix it, and he approached this task with the zeal of a zealot. Imagine the shock waves that must have rippled through the court in Berlin. The elaborate court orchestra, disbanded, the opulent royal stables, drastically reduced, the endless parade of courtiers and hangers-on, dismissed. Frederick William I famously sold off much of the royal plate, melted down gold and silver ornaments, and even dismissed most of his father's beloved artists and entertainers. He wore simple military uniforms, preferred plain food, and expected the same austere dedication from everyone around him. This wasn't just a preference, it was a policy, a radical declaration that the state's resources were not for personal indulgence but for its strength and survival. We're talking about a king who would personally inspect kitchens to ensure no food was wasted and patrolled the streets of Berlin, cane in hand, ready to admonish anyone he deemed idle or improperly dressed. It was a masterclass in austerity, a monarchical budget cut so severe it would make modern politicians blush. But where did all this saved money go? Ah, my friends, this is where the Soldier King truly earned his moniker. Every penny saved, every efficiency gained was poured into one singular obsession: the army. When Frederick William I inherited the throne, the Prussian army numbered around 38,000 men. By the end of his reign, he had nearly doubled it, creating a standing army of some 83,000 soldiers, an astonishing feat for a state of just 2.5 million people. To put that in perspective, Prussia, still a relatively poor and sparsely populated kingdom, possessed the fourth largest army in Europe, behind only France, Russia, and Austria. This wasn't just growth, it was a transformation, a complete redefinition of the state's priorities. He didn't just expand the army, he perfected it. Frederick William I was a drill master king, obsessed with every detail of military organization, training, and discipline. He introduced the, quote, 21, a form of conscription that divided the kingdom into districts, each responsible for supplying and training a regiment. This ensured a steady flow of recruits and integrated the military deeply into the fabric of society. He personally oversaw drills, designed uniforms, and even invented new marching techniques. The Prussian army became a finely tuned machine, renowned for its precision, its relentless discipline, and its unwavering loyalty. We can almost hear the rhythmic tramp of their boots, the barked commands, the precise movements that would become the hallmark of Prussian military might. And then, of course, there were his beloved quote to the lange curls, tall fellows. This was his personal pet project, a regiment of exceptionally tall soldiers, often recruited or even kidnapped from across Europe. He paid exorbitant sums for them, lavished them with attention, and took immense pride in their imposing stature. It was a curious personal quirk, perhaps, but it also served a purpose. These giants were a living symbol of Prussia's growing military prowess, a spectacle that impressed and intimidated foreign dignitaries. It was a bizarre, almost theatrical aspect of his reign, yet it perfectly encapsulated his complete immersion in military culture. But the Soldier King's reforms weren't limited to the barracks. He understood that a powerful army needed a powerful state to sustain it. He took the administrative structures put in place by his grandfather, the Great Elector, and honed them into an unprecedented instrument of state power. The General Directory was expanded and refined, becoming the central administrative body responsible for all aspects of government, finance, war, justice, and internal affairs. He personally supervised its work, demanding meticulous record-keeping, strict accountability, and absolute obedience. The bureaucracy he forged was legendary for its efficiency and incorruptibility, a stark contrast to the often venal administrations found elsewhere in Europe. Civil servants were expected to be diligent, loyal, and utterly dedicated to the service of the state. He instilled a deep-seated ethos of duty and sacrifice, a sense that every individual, from the highest minister to the humblest peasant, served the greater good of Prussia. This was the iron will we've spoken of, institutionalized, formalized, and stamped onto the very soul of the kingdom. Economically, Frederick William I was a staunch mercantilist. He sought to make Prussia self-sufficient, encouraging domestic industries, reclaiming vast tracts of marshland for agriculture, and promoting internal colonization. He welcomed skilled immigrants, much like his grandfather had welcomed the Huguenots, to boost the kingdom's productive capacity. He understood that a strong economy was the bedrock of a strong military, and he managed the state's finances with a miserly precision that ensured a full treasury, ready for any eventuality. He left his successor not just an army, but a remarkably healthy state budget. A paradox of power, the king who wouldn't fight. Here's the fascinating paradox, the truly intriguing aspect of Frederick William I's reign. Despite building arguably the finest army in Europe, he was profoundly reluctant to use it. He abhorred war, seeing it as an unnecessary drain on resources and a risk to the kingdom he had so painstakingly built. He preferred diplomacy, negotiation, and the sheer deterrent power of his formidable military. He was a master of strategic posturing, always ready to threaten, but rarely willing to unleash the hounds of war. His foreign policy was cautious and pragmatic, focused on consolidating Prussia's existing territories and securing its borders rather than embarking on ambitious conquests. He was content to be feared, respected, and left alone. It was a unique approach, building a terrifying weapon only to keep it sheathed, but it allowed Prussia to recover, to grow, and to solidify its foundations without the devastating costs of conflict. He accumulated capital, both financial and military, that his successors would later spend with remarkable effect. The shadow over Sans Souci, a king and his son. Yet, for all his successes in statecraft and military reform, Frederick William I's personal life was fraught with tension, particularly his relationship with his eldest surviving son, the future Frederick II. The soldier king, with his gruff Spartan nature, had little patience for his son's intellectual pursuits, his love of music, philosophy, and French culture. He wanted a soldier, a practical man, a mirror image of himself. What he got, or so he perceived, was a delicate, artistic young man who preferred the flute, the rifle. We'll delve much deeper into this tumultuous relationship in future chapters, but for now, understand that the royal household was often a battleground. Frederick William I's attempts to mould his son into his own image were relentless and often brutal, leading to a profound rift and even a dramatic escape attempt by the young prince. It's a poignant reminder that even the most successful rulers can face their greatest challenges within the walls of their own homes. This clash of personalities, this generational struggle, would have profound implications for the future of Prussia and, indeed, for European history. By the time Frederick William I died in 1740, he had utterly transformed Prussia. He had inherited a kingdom that was royal in name but poor in substance. a collection of scattered territories with a largely ceremonial army. He left behind a state that was financially solvent, administratively centralized, and possessed of a military machine that was the envy of Europe. He had forged the quote 24 of Prussia, not just into an abstract concept, but into a tangible, formidable reality. He was in essence the architect of the modern Prussian state, laying the rock-solid foundations upon which his son would build an empire, and it is to that son, the brilliant, complex, and utterly revolutionary figure who would truly unleash Prussia's power onto the European stage, that we turn next. The stage is set, the army is ready, and the treasury is full. What will happen when this formidable inheritance falls into the hands of a king who isn't afraid to use it? Join us next time as we meet Frederick the Great and witness the astonishing transformation of a kingdom into a true European power. Welcome back, history enthusiasts, to our continuing journey through the improbable rise of Prussia. In our last chapter, we left off with the intensely strained relationship between Frederick William I, the unquote 25, and his sensitive, artistic and intellectual son, Frederick. We saw a father who poured every ounce of his being into building an unparalleled military machine and an incorruptible bureaucracy, and a son who seemed to chafe against the very discipline that forged his inheritance. The stage was set, wasn't it? Wasn't. A formidable, disciplined, and financially sound kingdom, awaiting a king who, unlike his father, would not shy away from using its immense power. And so, in 1740, the curtain rose on a new act. Frederick William I, after years of relentless toil and a final, agonizing illness, passed away. The kingdom he had so meticulously crafted, the one he had built from the ground up with an almost fanatical dedication, was now in the hands of his successor, Frederick II. Now, if you were a contemporary observer in 1740, what would you have expected from this new monarch? Here was a prince known for his flute playing, his philosophical discussions with Voltaire, his disdain for military parades, and his love for French culture. Many surely anticipated a more enlightened, perhaps even softer reign, a king who might relax the rigid discipline, perhaps even scale back the colossal army that consumed nearly 80% of the state's budget. After all, the As Quotas 26 had built this army, but largely kept it in its barracks. Would his intellectual son follow suit, or perhaps even dismantle some of its more burdensome aspects? Oh, how quickly those expectations were shattered. The inheritance, a kingdom forged in iron. Let's be clear about what Frederick II inherited. He didn't just get a crown, he got a masterpiece of statecraft. His father had left him a full treasury, a meticulously managed economy, albeit a frugal one, and a bureaucracy that was the envy of Europe, efficient, honest, and utterly dedicated to the state. Most importantly, he inherited an army of 80,000 men. This wasn't just any army. It was the fourth largest in Europe, disproportionately huge for a state of Prussia's size and population. And it was arguably the best trained, most disciplined fighting force on the continent, honed to perfection through endless drills and rigid adherence to the Frederick William I, for all his eccentricities and brutal fathering, had given his son the ultimate tool for power projection. He had amassed the capital, both financial and human, and instilled the discipline. He had in essence built the perfect engine, and now his son, the seemingly unmilitary Frederick, was about to put his foot down on the accelerator. The audacious gamble, Silesia, 1740. The year 1740 was a pivotal one, not just for Prussia but for all of Europe. Emperor Charles VI of Austria died, leaving his vast Habsburg dominions to his daughter, Maria Theresa. This was a direct challenge to the traditional male succession laws of the Holy Roman Empire, and while Charles had secured the pragmatic sanction, an agreement recognizing Maria Theresa's right to inherit, many European powers, including Bavaria, France, and Spain, saw an opportunity to dismember the sprawling Habsburg Empire. And so did Frederick II. Just 2 months after ascending to the throne, in a move that shocked Europe and cemented his reputation for a strategic ruthlessness, Frederick launched his army into the rich Austrian province of Silesia. It was an audacious, unprovoked act of aggression, a lightning strike that caught Maria Theresa completely off guard. Why Silesia? This was not a whim, but a deeply calculated move. First, there were historical Hohenzollern claims to parts of Silesia, though tenuous. More importantly, Silesia was a prize beyond compare. It was strategically vital, bordering Brandenburg and the Duchy of Prussia, and its acquisition would consolidate Prussia's fragmented lands. Economically, it was a jewel, rich in minerals, with a burgeoning textile industry and a large productive population. It was the industrial heartland that landlocked sandy Brandenburg desperately needed. For Frederick, it was a moment of profound opportunity. Maria Theresa, a young, inexperienced ruler, was perceived as weak and vulnerable, facing challenges from all sides. He saw a chance to transform Prussia from a regional power, albeit a formidable one, into a true European player. This was his moment to show the world that Prussia was no longer content to be Europe's disciplined but overlooked sandbox. The First Silesian War, 1740 to 1742, a baptism of fire. The invasion of Silesia plunged Europe into the War of the Austrian Succession. For Frederick, it was a baptism of fire. He led his troops personally, often making tactical blunders due to his inexperience, but he had the good sense to listen to his seasoned generals, and what an army he had. The Prussian military machine forged by his father proved its worth on the battlefield. At the Battle of Mollwitz in 1741, the Prussians, though nearly defeated, ultimately prevailed, demonstrating their superior discipline and tactical training. Frederick himself famously fled the field at one point, only to return and find his army victorious. This initial success, despite his personal missteps, solidified his determination. The war continued, with Prussia proving its military might against the Habsburg forces. By 1742, with Austria facing pressure from other fronts, Maria Theresa was forced to negotiate. The Treaty of Breslau ceded most of Silesia to Prussia. It was a stunning victory, a territorial gain that instantly increased Prussia's population by 30% and provided the economic backbone it had always lacked. Prussia had not just gained territory, it had gained immense prestige and a new sense of national purpose. The Second Silesian War, 1744 to 1745, consolidating the gains. Maria Theresa, however, was not one to forget or forgive. The loss of Silesia gnawed at her, and as the larger war of the Austrian succession continued, she saw an opportunity to reclaim her lost province. In 1744 she launched a counter-offensive initiating the Second Silesian War. Frederick, now more experienced, was ready. He again led his armies, demonstrating growing tactical genius and an unshakable resolve. Battles like Hohenfriedberg, 1745, showcased the Prussian army's superior maneuverability and the devastating effectiveness of its cavalry. The Prussians, often outnumbered, fought with a ferocity and discipline that astounded their opponents. By the end of 1745, Maria Theresa was again compelled to make peace. The Treaty of Dresden confirmed Prussia's possession of Silesia. Frederick II had not only held on to his prize but had decisively proven Prussia's military superiority. He had taken the formidable tool his father had built and wielded it with devastating effect, securing a vital province that would forever alter Prussia's destiny. The Interlude of Peace, The Philosopher King at Work, 1745 to 1756. With Silesia firmly in his grasp, Frederick II spent the next decade consolidating his gains and preparing for the inevitable future conflicts. This period is often seen as the reign of the, quote, 29, quote, he returned to his intellectual pursuits, writing treatises on government and military strategy, composing music, and corresponding with the leading mind of the Enlightenment. He established the Académie Royale des Sciences et Belles Lettres and promoted religious toleration, famously declaring that, quote, Dies. But beneath this veneer of enlightened rule, Frederick was tirelessly strengthening his state. He initiated extensive legal reforms, creating a more uniform and just legal code. He promoted agriculture, draining swamps, clearing forests, and introducing new crops like the potato to improve food security. He encouraged industry, particularly mining and textiles in Silesia, and fostered trade. Crucially, he did not neglect the army. He meticulously analysed the lessons of the Silesian Wars, refining tactics, improving logistics, and ensuring that the Prussian military remained the sharpest instrument in Europe. He knew that Silesia, a rich prize, would always be coveted, and that Prussia's survival depended entirely on its ability to defend what it had so audaciously seized. The diplomatic revolution and the gathering storm. Maria Theresa, however, never truly accepted the loss of Silesia. Her burning desire for revenge would drive the next great European conflict. During the peace, Europe witnessed a dramatic realignment of alliances, known as the Diplomatic Revolution. For centuries, France and the Habsburgs had been bitter enemies, but Maria Theresa, seeing Britain as an unreliable ally and Frederick II as the primary threat, made the unthinkable choice. She allied with France. Russia, under Empress Elizabeth, also viewed Frederick's growing power with suspicion and joined the Austrian-French alliance. Sweden and Saxony also joined this formidable coalition. Suddenly, Prussia found itself encircled. The small landlocked kingdom, with its disproportionately large army, was now facing down the combined might of three of Europe's great powers: Austria, France, and Russia. It was a perilous situation, one that threatened to undo everything the Hohenzollerns had built over 2 centuries. Frederick, ever the pragmatist, sought an ally. He found one in Great Britain, which, concerned about French power and eager to protect its Hanoverian possessions, signed the Convention of Westminster with Prussia in 1756. This alliance, however, was more one of convenience than deep commitment, and Prussia would largely fight alone. By 1756 the storm clouds had gathered. Frederick knew that a war was inevitable, and that his enemies intended to dismember Prussia and strip him of Silesia. True to his character, he decided to strike first. In August 1756, without a formal declaration of war, he marched his army into Saxony, a neutral state but a key ally of Austria, seizing its capital, Dresden. This preemptive strike ignited what would become the bloodiest and most widespread conflict of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War. Frederick II, the Scout 32, was about to embark on the ultimate test of his military genius and his kingdom's endurance, a struggle for Prussia's very existence against overwhelming odds. The disciplined, ruthless state forged by generations of Hohenzollerns was now on the precipice, facing a challenge that would either shatter it into a million pieces or elevate it to an unimaginable height. How would this unlikely kingdom born from sand and swamps survive such a colossal onslaught? That, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. Welcome back, history enthusiasts, to the epic saga of Prussia. If you've been following our journey, you know we left Frederick II, now known to history as Frederick the Great, on the precipice of an abyss. In 1756, he had launched a preemptive strike into Saxony, igniting the 7 Years' War, a conflict that would pit his relatively small, though formidable, kingdom against a coalition of Europe's mightiest powers, Austria, France, and Russia. It was, quite simply, a fight for Prussia's very existence. Could this improbable state, forged in sand and iron, survive such overwhelming odds? Could one man, however brilliant, outwit and outfight the combined might of 3 empires? The world watched, fully expecting Prussia to be dismembered, swallowed whole by its ravenous neighbours. Frederick's gamble, born of desperation and a clear-eyed assessment of the looming threat, was audacious. He knew that waiting for the coalition to strike first would be suicide. His invasion of Saxony was meant to secure a strategic buffer and provide resources, but it also confirmed the worst fears of his enemies. The war that followed was not merely a territorial dispute, it was an existential struggle that would stretch Prussia's, quote, 33, quote, to its absolute breaking point. Imagine, if you will, being Frederick in those early years. You are surrounded. To the south, the Habsburg armies of Maria Theresa, burning with vengeance for the loss of Silesia, are advancing. To the east, the colossal, seemingly endless forces of Imperial Russia are slowly but inexorably grinding their way through East Prussia. And to the west, the armies of France and the Holy Roman Empire are mobilizing. Prussia was a small, elongated kingdom, lacking natural defences, its heartland exposed on all sides. It was truly a nation fighting on 3 fronts, with a population of barely 4.5 million against the combined tens of millions of its adversaries. The early years of the war were a dizzying whirlwind of strategic brilliance and desperate gambles. Frederick, a man who believed in decisive action, moved his forces with astonishing speed. In 1757, he achieved 2 legendary victories that cemented his reputation as one of history's greatest military commanders. First, at Rossbach, his numerically inferior Prussian army utterly routed a combined French and Imperial force. It was a masterclass in manoeuvre and discipline, showcasing the devastating effectiveness of Prussian drill and Frederick's tactical genius. Then, just weeks later, he marched his exhausted troops hundreds of miles south to confront the Austrians in Silesia. at Leuthen. Against an army twice the size of his own, Frederick executed a brilliant oblique order, crushing the Austrians and securing Silesia once more. These were victories forged in the crucible of desperation, against all logical odds. But these triumphs came at a terrible cost. The Prussian army, though highly effective, was a finite resource. Every battle, even a victory, depleted its ranks. And while Frederick could win battles, he could not be everywhere at once. The sheer numerical superiority of the coalition meant that even as he won in one sector, another front was collapsing. In 1758, Frederick faced the Russians at Zorndorf, a bloodbath that saw both sides suffer horrific casualties. Though the Russians were forced to withdraw, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Later that year, at Hochkirch, the Austrians launched a surprise night attack, inflicting a severe defeat on the Prussians. Frederick himself narrowly escaped capture. By 1759, the situation grew increasingly dire. At Kunersdorf, Frederick suffered arguably the worst defeat of his career. Attacking a well-entrenched Russian and Austrian army, his forces were decimated. He lost over 18,000 men, a staggering proportion of his army. In the aftermath, a despairing Frederick wrote to his minister, quote, 34. He even contemplated suicide. This was the raw, brutal reality of the 7 Years' War, a relentless grind that pushed the, quote, 35 to the absolute limits of human endurance and leadership. Yet, Prussia, battered and bleeding, refused to die. This was not just Frederick's war, it was the war of an entire state, a people indoctrinated in the discipline and sacrifice demanded by the Hohenzollerns. The efficient bureaucracy continued to function, extracting every last resource. The canton system, established by his father, ensured that new recruits, though often less experienced, could be quickly brought into the ranks. The Junker nobility, though often resentful of royal power in peacetime, now fought with ferocious loyalty, for their very estates were at stake. The years 1760 and 1761 were the nadir. Prussia was exhausted. Its cities were shelled, its countryside plundered. Berlin itself was briefly occupied by Russian and Austrian forces in 1760, though they withdrew after only a few days, unable to hold the city against Frederick's main army. The coffers were empty, the manpower reserves stretched thin. Frederick, constantly on the move, fighting defensively, seemed to be simply delaying the inevitable. His letters from this period are filled with a profound weariness, a sense of fighting against fate itself. He was like a cornered lion, still dangerous but clearly weakening. And then, just when all hope seemed lost, when the maps were being drawn up for the dismemberment of Prussia, a seismic event occurred that would forever be known as the, quote, 36, quote, on January 5th, 1762, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died. This was not just a change of monarch, it was a complete reversal of policy. Elizabeth, a staunch enemy of Frederick, was succeeded by her nephew, Peter III. Now Peter was, to put it mildly, an eccentric character. He was also a fanatical admirer of Frederick the Great. Upon his ascension, Peter immediately withdrew Russia from the war, pulling his massive armies out of East Prussia and the coalition. But he didn't stop there. In an astonishing turn of events, Peter III actually signed an alliance with Prussia, offering Frederick Russian troops and resources. Can you imagine the shockwaves this sent through Europe? The entire balance of power shifted overnight. Austria and France, who had been on the verge of victory, suddenly found themselves without their most powerful Eastern ally. The seemingly insurmountable coalition had fractured, not through military defeat, but through a single stroke of fate. Frederick, who had been on the brink of despair, was revitalized. The sudden relief was almost overwhelming. With Russia out of the picture and even providing aid, he was able to concentrate his remaining strength against Austria. Though Peter III was quickly overthrown and assassinated by his wife, Catherine the Great, who would later become Empress Catherine II, Catherine maintained Russia's neutrality, which was still a colossal boon for Prussia. The remaining years of the war saw Frederick, though still operating with limited resources, push back against the Austrians. The Treaty of Hubertusburg, signed in February 1763, finally brought the brutal conflict to an end. The terms were simple: a return to the status quo ante bellum. Prussia retained Silesia. No territory was lost. Prussia had survived. This was not just survival, it was a triumph of the will. The 7 Years' War, a conflict that should have utterly destroyed Prussia, instead confirmed its status as a European great power. Frederick II, who had entered the war as a king, emerged as Frederick the Great, a legendary figure whose military genius, administrative skill, and sheer resilience had saved his kingdom from annihilation. But the cost was immense. Prussia was devastated. Up to 10% of its population had perished. Its economy was in tatters, its lands ravaged. The war had been a furnace that burned away everything but the essential core of the Prussian state: discipline, sacrifice, and an unyielding dedication to survival. Frederick, now truly the philosopher king who had endured the ultimate test, turned his prodigious energy to rebuilding. He initiated extensive reforms, promoting agriculture, industry, and trade. He reformed the justice system, abolished torture, and codified laws. He drained swamps, built canals, and resettled devastated areas. He continued to strengthen his army, ensuring that Prussia would never again be so vulnerable. He famously declared, "An army is a state within a state," and he treated it as such, an indispensable instrument of national survival. The 7 Years' War cemented the image of Prussia as a Spartan, militaristic state, one defined by its efficiency, its discipline, and its readiness for war. But it also revealed a pragmatic, enlightened side to Frederick's rule in peacetime. He fostered religious tolerance, patronized the arts and sciences, though still preferring French culture to German, and viewed himself as the first servant of the state. His final great act in 1772 was the first partition of Poland, a cynical but strategically crucial move that saw Prussia acquire West Prussia. This territory, though relatively poor, finally connected the scattered eastern and western halves of his kingdom, bridging the gap between Brandenburg and the old Duchy of Prussia. It was a testament to the Hohenzollern pragmatism and opportunistic expansion, a final necessary step in consolidating the disparate threads of their unlikely empire. Frederick the Great died in 1786, leaving behind a kingdom transformed. From a forgotten backwater, Prussia had, under his leadership, become a true European power, its borders secured, its institutions refined, and its identity forged in the fires of war. But what kind of legacy would this disciplined militaristic state leave for Europe? and how would the seeds of its unique character blossom in the tumultuous centuries to come? That, my friends, is a story for our next chapter. Welcome back, history buffs, to dreamy history. We left off with Frederick the Great, the legendary Old Fritz, finally laying down his earthly burdens in 1786. His reign, a masterclass in strategic survival and state-building, had elevated Prussia from a mere regional player to an undisputed European great power. He had left behind a meticulously organised state, a full treasury, and, crucially, an army feared across the continent. But what happens when the architect of such an improbable rise steps off the stage? Can the edifice stand without its genius builder? That, dear friends, is the question we grapple with in Chapter 8. For Prussia, the period immediately following Frederick the Great's death was less a seamless transition, and more a slow, almost imperceptible drift away from the principles that had forged its greatness, only to be violently awakened by the thunderclap of a new age. The twilight of the old order, Frederick William II. Frederick the Great had no direct heir. His successor was his nephew, Frederick William II, who ascended to the throne in 1786. And here we encounter a stark contrast. Where old Fritz was ascetic, rational, and relentlessly pragmatic, his nephew was, well, different. Frederick William II was a man of artistic sensibilities, a patron of the arts, and much to the chagrin of the old guard, deeply interested in mysticism and spiritualism. The Enlightenment with its cold logic had held sway under Frederick the Great. Now, a more romantic, even esoteric spirit began to permeate the Prussian court. This shift wasn't just a matter of personal taste, it had tangible policy implications. The Spartan austerity that had defined Frederick the Great's court and trickled down through the state apparatus began to erode. Frederick William II loved splendour, music, and the finer things in life. The treasury, so carefully filled by his uncle, saw its coffers open more freely. While he did maintain and even expand the army, the rigorous discipline and constant personal oversight that Frederick the Great had embodied were conspicuously absent. The machine was still there, polished and formidable on the surface, but the driving force, the daily grind of the soldier king or the great elector, was missing. Yet despite this internal softening, Prussia continued its territorial expansion under Frederick William II, albeit through means that further solidified its reputation for strategic ruthlessness. We're talking, of course, about the partitions of Poland. Remember, Frederick the Great had initiated the first partition in 1772, primarily to connect his fragmented territories. The subsequent partitions, driven by the geopolitical appetites of Prussia, Russia, and Austria, completed the dismemberment of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Frederick William II oversaw the Second Partition in 1793, and the Third Partition in 1795. These acquisitions brought vast new territories into the Prussian fold, including areas that would become West Prussia, further solidifying the land bridge to East Prussia, South Prussia, and New East Prussia. From a purely pragmatic Hohenzollern perspective, these were undeniable successes. They dramatically increased Prussia's landmass, population, and strategic depth. But they also left a lasting moral stain, contributing to the narrative of Prussia as a predatory power, willing to sacrifice its neighbours for its own aggrandizement. The iron will that had once been focused on self-preservation now seemed to extend to opportunistic expansion at the expense of a weaker neighbour. The gathering storm, revolutionary France and Napoleon, but as Prussia was busy carving up Poland, a far more fundamental and earth-shattering change was unfolding to its west. The erst French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 wasn't just a local Parisian uprising. It was a seismic event that sent tremors across every royal court in Europe. The old order, based on divine right and aristocratic privilege, was being violently challenged. Initially, Prussia, along with Austria, joined the first coalition against revolutionary France. The idea was to quickly put down the, quote, 43 and restore the Bourbons. But the French, fueled by revolutionary fervour and mass conscription, proved far more resilient than anticipated. After some initial setbacks, and with the partitions of Poland occupying much of Prussia's attention and military resources, Frederick William II pulled Prussia out of the conflict with the Arch Treaty of Basel in 1795. This treaty inaugurated a decade of Prussian neutrality. On the surface, it seemed a shrewd move. While the rest of Europe plunged into the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia enjoyed a period of peace, consolidating its Polish gains and rebuilding its finances. But this neutrality, in hindsight, was a poisoned chalice. It bred a dangerous complacency, a false sense of security that their formidable army, still living on the laurels of Frederick the Great, was invincible. Meanwhile, France, under the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, was transforming warfare itself. Gone were the carefully choreographed manoeuvres of the 18th century. In their place came lightning-fast campaigns, massive armies, and a relentless focus on annihilating the enemy's main force. Napoleon was not just a general. He was a political and military revolutionary, and his methods were about to expose the profound weaknesses that had crept into the Prussian system. The hesitant monarch, Frederick William III. Frederick William II died in 1797, leaving the impending storm to his son. Frederick William III. If his father had been a departure from Frederick the Great, Frederick William III was almost an antithesis. He was a deeply conscientious man, well-intentioned, and personally frugal, trying to rein in the excesses of his father's reign. He was devoted to his family, particularly his beloved wife, Queen Louise, who would become a symbol of Prussian resilience. But he was also profoundly indecisive, cautious to a fault, and lacked the strategic genius or the iron will needed to navigate the treacherous waters of Napoleonic Europe. For years, Frederick William III clung to neutrality, even as Napoleon systematically dismantled the Holy Roman Empire, reorganized Germany under French influence, and defeated Prussia's traditional allies. He watched as Austria was humbled at Austerlitz in 1805. He watched as the map of Europe was redrawn by French hands. The vaunted Prussian army, still drilled in the tactics of Frederick the Great, was a relic of a bygone era, its commanders aged and complacent, its spirit sapped by years of inaction. The, quote, 45 that had once defined the state seemed to have rusted from within, finally pushed to the brink by French incursions into Prussian territory and Napoleon's contemptuous disregard for Prussian sovereignty. Frederick William III, against his better judgment and much too late, decided to confront the French emperor. It was a decision born of humiliation and desperation, not strategic calculation. The catastrophe of 1806 Jena Auerstedt. The year is 1806. Prussia, alone and isolated, declared war on France. The stage was set for a clash between the old and the new, between the legacy of Frederick the Great and the revolutionary genius of Napoleon. The outcome was nothing short of catastrophic. On October 14th, 1806, two major battles unfolded simultaneously: Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon himself faced the main Prussian army under the aging Prince Hohenzollern. The Prussian command structure was antiquated, their tactics rigid, and their movements slow. They were outmanoeuvred, outfought, and utterly routed by Napoleon's dynamic forces. It was a complete and crushing defeat. But the true scale of the disaster was revealed at Auerstedt. There, a smaller Prussian force, commanded by the Duke of Brunswick, a veteran of Frederick the Great's wars, encountered the bulk of Marshal Davout's French corps. Davout, a brilliant and relentless commander, was heavily outnumbered, yet through sheer tactical brilliance, iron discipline, and relentless fighting, his corps inflicted a devastating defeat on the main Prussian army. The Duke of Brunswick was mortally wounded, and the Prussian forces collapsed into a panicked retreat. The twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt were not just defeats, they were an annihilation. The Prussian army, once the envy of Europe, ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Its fabled discipline dissolved into chaos, its officers either killed, captured, or demoralized. The aura of invincibility, painstakingly built over generations, was shattered in a single day. The aftermath was brutal. French forces poured into Prussia, occupying Berlin within 2 weeks. The Hohenzollern dynasty, for the first time in centuries, faced total ruin. The quote, 46 of the state had been tested, and it had been found wanting, rusted by complacency and indecision. The humiliation of Tilsit. The humiliation culminated in the Treaty of Tilsit in July 1807. Frederick William III, accompanied by his spirited Queen Louise, met with Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. It was a scene of utter degradation for Prussia. Queen Louise, with her courage and grace, famously tried to charm Napoleon into more lenient terms, but to no avail. The terms of the treaty were devastating. Prussia lost nearly half of its territory, including all its Polish acquisitions, which became the Duchy of Warsaw under French influence, and its lands west of the Elbe River, which formed the Kingdom of Westphalia. Its population was reduced from 9.7 million to 4.5 million. It was forced to pay massive war indemnities to France. Its army was drastically reduced to a mere 42,000 men. French troops occupied key Prussian fortresses and territories. Prussia was forced to join Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade against Great Britain. This was not just a defeat, it was an existential crisis. Prussia, the state forged in the crucible of desperation, the unlikely power that defied every expectation, was now on its knees, a mere shadow of its former self, a French satellite. The dream of a powerful, independent Prussia seemed utterly extinguished. But here, dear listeners, is where the story truly gets interesting. For it is often in the depths of despair that true character is revealed. The quote that had seemed to fail at Jena Auerstedt would now be reforged, not by a single genius monarch, but by a generation of reformers, intellectuals and military minds who refused to let Prussia die. The stage is set for a remarkable, almost unbelievable, national revival. How could a state so utterly broken rise again? That, as we'll discover, is the next chapter in the extraordinary history of Prussia. The year 1807. Prussia, the state forged in sand and iron, the unlikely power that defied every geographical and demographic disadvantage, lay prostrate. Napoleon's boot pressed firmly on its neck. The Treaty of Tilsit had carved away half its territory, imposed crippling indemnities, and reduced its once proud army to a mere shadow, limited to 42,000 men. Imagine, if you will, the collective despair, the profound humiliation. The iron will that had defined the Hohenzollerns and their state for centuries seemed not merely bent, but utterly shattered. The very notion of Prussia as a great power, or even an independent one, felt like a cruel joke. Its capital, Berlin, was occupied. Its king, Frederick William III, a man of indecision and melancholic temperament, had fled to Königsberg, a distant outpost in what remained of his eastern territories. The state was a skeleton stripped bare, its finances ruined, its spirit crushed. We've seen Prussia face adversity before. The devastation of the 30 Years' War, the existential threat of the 7 Years' War. But this was different. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was an ideological annihilation, a complete dismantling of the old order by the revolutionary force of France. You might think this was the end of the story, the final ignominious chapter for the Hohenzollern dream. But if there's one thing we've learned about Prussia, it's that its greatest strength often lay in its darkest hours, in its uncanny ability to adapt, to learn from defeat, and to rebuild with an almost fanatical determination. What emerged from these ashes was not a simple restoration, but a profound transformation, a series of radical reforms that would fundamentally redefine the Prussian state and its people, setting the stage for an astonishing rebirth. The crucible of reform, reshaping a nation. The humiliation of 1806 to 1807 was a brutal, undeniable lesson. The old Prussian system, for all its famed discipline and efficiency, had become ossified. Its army, once the envy of Europe, had rested on its laurels, its tactics outdated, its officer corps riddled with aristocratic privilege. Its society, though well ordered, lacked the national fervour that Napoleon had so effectively harnessed in France. To survive, Prussia needed to become something new, something modern, something that could tap into the power of its own people. It was in this desperate crucible that a remarkable group of reformers stepped forward, often against significant internal resistance from conservatives and even the king himself, but driven by an urgent sense of national survival. 1. Administrative and social revolution, Stein and Hardenberg. First among these intellectual giants was Heinrich Friedrich Karl vom und zum Stein. A Westphalian nobleman, not a native Prussian, Stein was a passionate advocate for a more efficient, less centralized, and crucially, more engaged state. He believed that the strength of a nation lay not just in its monarch or its army, but in the active participation of its citizens. Under his brief but impactful tenure as First Minister, 1807 to 1808, Stein launched a series of reforms that were nothing short of revolutionary for Prussia. Abolition of serfdom, 1807. This was perhaps his most profound social reform. The Edict of Emancipation declared that From St. Martin's Day, 1810, there shall be only free persons. This freed the peasantry from their feudal obligations to the Junkers, allowing them to own land and move freely. It was a massive step towards a modern, mobile labour force and a more equitable society, even if many peasants initially struggled to acquire land. Municipal self-government, 1808. Stein introduced the principle of local autonomy. Cities were granted the right to elect their own councils and administer their own affairs, fostering a sense of civic responsibility and participation that had been largely absent in the highly centralized Hohenzollern state. Reform of the state administration. He streamlined the bureaucracy, creating a more professional and meritocratic civil service, reducing the influence of the old aristocratic cliques and laying the groundwork for the efficient Prussian administration that would become legendary. Stein's vision was one of a state strengthened by individual freedom and responsibility, a stark contrast to the purely top-down absolutism of the past. His reforms were a blueprint for a modern nation, but his anti-French stance and his growing influence ultimately led to Napoleon demanding his dismissal and exile in 1808. His successor, Karl August von Hardenberg, a shrewd diplomat and equally dedicated reformer, picked up the torch. Serving as Chancellor from 1810, Hardenberg continued the work of modernization, focusing heavily on economic liberalization. Economic liberalization. He dismantled many of the old guild restrictions, promoting free trade and competition. This was crucial for stimulating economic growth in a state struggling under French indemnities. Further land reform. Hardenberg continued the process of land privatization, allowing peasants to purchase land from their former landlords, albeit often at significant cost. Tax reform. He sought to rationalize the complex and often inequitable tax system, aiming for a more uniform and efficient collection of revenue. Together, Stein and Hardenberg fundamentally altered the social and economic fabric of Prussia, moving it away from a feudal agrarian society towards a more modern capitalist one, and laying the groundwork for a more unified national identity. 2. Military rebirth, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. While Stein and Hardenberg were reshaping the state's foundations, a parallel, equally radical transformation was occurring within the military, driven by the brilliant minds of Jazz Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau. They understood that the old army, a professional force of mercenaries and long-serving conscripts, officered by aristocrats, was no match for Napoleon's citizen armies. Their reforms were revolutionary. Meritocracy. They broke the stranglehold of aristocratic privilege on the officer corps, opening promotion to talent and merit regardless of birth. This was a direct assault on the Junker tradition, but vital for injecting new life and competence into the army. Universal conscription, the Krumper system. The Treaty of Tilsit limited Prussia's army to 42,000 men. Scharnhorst devised a cunning workaround, a rapid rotation system. Men would be conscripted, intensively trained for a short period, then discharged to the reserves, making way for new recruits. This meant that while the standing army remained within treaty limits, Prussia was secretly building up a large, trained reserve force, the Krumper system, named after the Krumper cripples, who were often used to fill the official ranks while fit men trained and rotated out. Modernization of tactics and training. They overhauled training methods, emphasizing initiative, skirmishing, and combined arms tactics, moving away from the rigid linear formations that had failed so spectacularly at Jena Auerstedt. The Landwehr, its militia. Gneisenau, in particular, championed the idea of a national militia, a citizen army that would fight not just for the king, but for the fatherland. This would become crucial in the later wars of liberation, mobilizing the population in a way Prussia had never seen before. Moral and national spirit. They instilled a new ethos in the army, fostering a sense of national pride and duty. Soldiers were no longer just instruments of the king, but defenders of Prussia itself. These military reforms were not just about creating a more effective fighting force. They were about forging a national army, an embodiment of the people's will, ready to reclaim Prussia's independence. 3. Educational Renaissance. Wilhelm von Humboldt. Crucially, the reforms weren't solely focused on the practicalities of governance and war. The Prussians understood that a renewed nation also needed a renewed spirit, cultivated through education. Wilhelm von Humboldt, a philosopher and linguist, led a sweeping reform of the Prussian educational system. Foundation of the University of Berlin, 1810. This was perhaps Humboldt's most enduring legacy. Designed as a centre of research and teaching free from direct state and church control, it attracted leading scholars and became a beacon of intellectual freedom and excellence. It aimed to cultivate critical thinking, scientific inquiry, and a deep sense of national culture. Restructuring of secondary education. Humboldt also reformed the Gymnasien, grammar schools, emphasizing a broad classical education alongside scientific and modern subjects, preparing students for university and public service. These educational reforms aim to create an educated, patriotic citizenry capable of contributing to the state and fostering a strong sense of national identity. They were about building intellectual capital, recognizing that the strength of a nation also lay in the minds of its people. The years between 1807 and 1812 were a period of intense, often painful, self-reflection and rebuilding for Prussia. It was a time when the, quote, 50 was not just a monarch's decree, but began to permeate a broader segment of society. The reforms, though incomplete and often resisted, were laying the groundwork for a truly national awakening. Intellectuals like Johann Gottlieb Fichte delivered fiery addresses to the German nation in occupied Berlin, urging his countrymen to embrace a unique German identity and spirit. Poets like Ernst Moritz Arndt penned patriotic verses calling for resistance against the French oppressor. Prussia was still under Napoleon's thumb, forced to contribute troops to his disastrous Russian campaign in 1812. The king remained hesitant, constantly weighing the risks of defiance against the humiliation of submission. But beneath the surface, a new Prussia was stirring. The reforms had not only modernized the state and its military, but had also ignited a nascent sense of national pride and a burning desire for revenge. The disciplined, efficient state was being reforged, but this time it was harnessing not just the will of the Hohenzollerns, but the burgeoning will of its people. The stage was set. The phoenix, though still bound, was gathering its strength, preparing to rise from the ashes of Tilsit. The opportunity would soon come, borne on the icy winds of Russia, when Napoleon's grand empire would finally begin to crack, and when it did, a revitalized Prussia armed with a new army and a new national spirit, would be ready to play its part in Europe's dramatic shift of power.